So we're in a little series on called Living Hope. It's about the journey of faith. It's based in Hebrews 11. And I just want to quickly just spend a little bit of time this morning just talking about Sarah. Last week, Clive helped us to understand Abraham a bit, unpacked Abraham's life. And of course, Abraham was married to Sarah, and she's listed in Hebrews 11 as one of those characters who put their confidence and their trust in God. And Hebrews 11 talks clearly about what it takes to really please God. Anyone know what it takes to please God? Faith. Faith. What does pleasing God look like? It looks like faith. What does faith look like? It looks like pleasing God. Faith is ultimately worship. We can sing songs and we love doing that. We can gather corporately like that. But genuine worship is a trust and reliance on Jesus. What is faith? It's pleasing God. But faith is also dependence on God. If I was to give faith a definition, I would say it's this. It's trusting in God. It's depending on Him. So if someone comes up to me and says, how do I know if I'm growing in God? Or how can I tell somebody else who's growing in God? I'd say it's simply this. Are we growing in our dependence on God? Are we learning over time through the thick and thin of life, through the mountaintops and through the valleys? Are we learning to place our dependence on God? And as we do that, through the difficult times, through the waiting, through the trials, we grow in faith. And as we grow in faith, we grow in our pleasing of God. And that's the story of Sarah. And I'm just going to read from Hebrews 11 and just verse 11, where it mentions Sarah in this kind of hall of fame of faith. It says this, and by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children. Why? Because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. She considered, there's an intention there. There was a point in Sarah's life where she considered that he was faithful who made the promise. We're going to unpack that a bit. It took Sarah a lifetime to get to this place of trust. And guess what? God is faithful as we journey through life. He's faithful in our journey of faith because he knows we've come from a place where faith in him is not part of the way we live. And so as we learn to trust in him, he is faithful as we develop faith in him. And that's why we can be confident, because his faithfulness always trumps our limitations. You know, Abraham and Sarah's story is an Exodus story. Out of the Mesopotamian, polytheistic world of Ur of the Chaldeans, Abraham and his family were called to leave. It's significant. You know, Abraham was hearing voices of a God that he didn't know. They had all kinds of gods, many, many gods. And Abraham starting to respond to these voices. But often getting out of the world that we're used to is easier than getting the world out of us. That takes time and often includes wilderness journeying. But the promise maker says go. And it's our responsibility to say, Lord, I want to submit to you. You're the promise maker. And that's what Clive said. I think that was the nub of what Clive said last week. Faith is about going. It's about placing our dependence on the promise maker. But how can we do that when we don't know the promise maker? And for both Abraham and Sarah, they didn't know this deity that was telling them to go. And that's significant. So let me introduce you to Sarah. Sarah, originally named Sarai, which means my princess, her name was changed to Sarah, which means princess. And our story unfolds in Genesis 12 to 21. We've got some key reference points up on the screen. This princess, Sarah, she was barren. Genesis 12, Sarah follows Abraham into the unknown, leaving her home from the security and comfort of what I think was a pretty decent life in Ur to an unknown land. This is massive. This is massive. In chapter 12, Abraham is hearing voices. A God they're not familiar with is promising a new home, and he's promising descendants from them that will form a nation. Now, you've got to understand that Sarah was barren. So there's a couple of big things happening here. There's a couple of impossible situations. One is that Abraham is listening to a God, a deity that they're not familiar with, because there were many deities in Mesopotamia. So Abraham is listening to a voice. He's responding to that voice, and that voice is saying, you're going to have a land and you're going to have descendants. That's impossible because Sarah's barren and they live in Mesopotamia. This was a significant promise. And then the next point in Genesis 12 and verse 12 and 20, Abraham, fearing for his own life due to Sarah's princess-like beauty, asked Sarah to present herself as his sister to both Pharaoh in Egypt and to Abimelech. She was put in harm's way by Abraham to protect his own skin. Now, I don't know about you, but we all go through very tough situations in life. But I've got a feel for Sarah. One is she's barren. Now she's been asked to leave her home. This God who's speaking to her husband is saying, you're going to have many descendants. But then her husband puts her in harm's way and says, will you pretend that you're my sister and go into Pharaoh and go to Abimelech to save my skin? This poor woman is really having a raw deal, a tough time. You know, we all go through pain in this life. It's almost impossible to skip pain. So I want us to see so much of our lives in Sarah's life. We find ourselves in situations that we wish we weren't in. And then we find God saying to us and making promises to us. We think, how can that ever be? How can that ever be? That is impossible. And then in Genesis 16, in her doubt and impatience, she gives Hagar to Abraham, trying to fulfill God's promises her own way. It's a mess, but that's what we do. When we can't see a way that God can intervene, when we can't see a way through, we then start to engineer the blessing towards ourselves. We engineer blessing. I know I do it. So much of my life I've done that. I've tried to bless myself instead of waiting for God's blessing. And God's calling us to be patient, to wait. And so we know the story. Hagar becomes a surrogate mother. Ishmael is born. And the mess that we see in the Middle East today, right now, is as a result of that trying to bless myself. But there's something in me that doesn't criticize Sarah, but just feels for her. She's come from a broken journey. And this God, this Yahweh, is trying to teach her to trust him. And he is faithful. And he doesn't sideline Sarah because of this mistake, but he says, I am faithful and I will teach you how to trust me. I love that. There'll be people in this room, you've not come from any faith background, or you've had your confidence and faith in something completely different and someone completely different to God. And this God, Jesus Christ, Yahweh himself, is teaching you to trust. He's teaching you to depend on him. He's teaching you to not engineer your own blessings, but to trust him for his. And then in Genesis 18, when God's messengers tell Abraham that Sarah will bear a child in her old age, she laughs. She laughs in skepticism. She laughs in feeling, how can that ever be? Look at me. I'm barren. How can I bear a child? I'm 89 years old. She was 89 at this time. How can this ever be? And she laughs. And then when these messengers of God say to her, why did you laugh? She lied. She said, I didn't laugh. And we all do that. I do that. You do that. We somehow find it so hard sometimes to believe the promises of God, or there's so much pain in us that when God does promise, we laugh. We laugh in skepticism. And then wonderfully in Genesis 21, Isaac is born. A boy is born. A miracle baby. And there's a wonderful irony. The man and the woman that laugh in skepticism, because Abraham laughed as well, call their child laughter. There's an irony in that, isn't there? Every time they looked at Isaac, they remembered, oh, we laughed, but now we're laughing. And God wants to move our laughter to laughter. Our laughing in skepticism to laughing in joy. Let me just read Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1 through to 7. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said. And the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very same time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. And when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. I want us to learn just really quickly 4 lessons. 4 lessons from Sarah's faith. Lesson number 1. God's promises are not limited by our circumstances. God's promises, you need to hear this, are not limited by our circumstances. God's promise is not dependent on Sarah's physical ability, but on his power. Let me ask you this. What promises of God are you discounting in your life because of your current limitations? I was talking to Barry just before the meeting started, and we were talking about the limitations that we have because of physical things that we grow up with. But you know what? Our limitations do not have to be our restrictions. And God somehow goes above our limitations and proves that his power is greater than our limitations. Faith is believing that God's invisible character trumps our visible circumstances. Faith is believing that God's invisible character trumps our visible circumstances. Faith is believing that however impossible our situation is even more possible, even more impossible that God should lie. It says in Hebrews that God is not a man that he should lie. God is not a man that he should lie. So that's what God does. His promises are not limited to our circumstances. 2, faith grows over time through encounter and not just explanation. Trust is an interesting thing, isn't it? It takes a long time to build trust, but it takes a moment to destroy it. But we learn to trust not based on the promise, but based on the character of the promise maker. So I want to say it like this. The promise maker is the promise keeper. But we need to learn to know the promise maker. Because if we only focus on the promise, our eyes are fixed on the wrong thing. Our eyes should be fixed on the one that makes the promise, that his character is dependable. And we do see a turning in Sarah. It states it in Hebrews 11, verse 11, that she considered the promise maker to be the promise keeper. The one who promised is faithful. It's important that we see that God's delays are not his denials. God's delays are not his denials. And we shift our focus from the outcome that we are waiting for to the character of the one who promised the outcome. That's hard because we're so outcome driven. But God wants us to shift our focus to the promise keeper. I don't know if anyone's got a £20 note or a £50 note they would give me. Anyone got a £20 note, £50 note? I'll give it back to you, I promise you. I'm not going to be a magician and make it disappear. But if anyone here, seriously, if anyone's got a £20 note or a £50 note, have a look in your, just bring it. Oh, great, thank you. Thank you. That's great. That's good. Thank you. Has anyone else got one? No. I'll come back to that in just a bit. The faithfulness of God is not dependent on us, but it endures through our own doubts and unbelief as it waits for our faith to catch up. And that's what's happening in Sarah's journey. Her faith, from all of her background and all of her pain, God was not giving up on her. Through all of her mistakes, he was waiting and he was teaching her that he was reliable. He was teaching her that he could be trusted. He was teaching her that the promise that he made could be relied upon because he is faithful. On this £20 note is a promise. It's on all of the UK notes. It says this: I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £20. There's a promise on this £20 note. You know, back in 1961, this £20 note, when I was born, was worth around about £800. That's inflation. But I can take this £20 note over to Morrison's and get my picnic. Thank you, Andrew. And I may even get enough to share with you. But why can I depend on this promise? It's just a promise. Who's making this promise? Well, this promise on this £20 note is backed up by two things that I can rely on. One, it's backed up by the fact, actually on this £20 note, it's got the Queen's head on it. But on the new £20 notes, it's got the King's head on it. So this £20 note is reinforced by the King and the monarchy of England, of Great Britain. So the promise stands because of the monarchy. But also, this promise of this being worth £20 to me is backed up because there's a signature on this £20 note, and it's that signature of the Treasurer of the Bank of England. So I've got the guarantee of the monarch, and I've got the guarantee of the Bank of England that this £20 note will get me quite a few packets of sandwiches over at Morrison's in a bit. Thank you, Andrew. But I say that because the promise maker is the promise keeper. And we can rely on his promises because of his character. And so take your eyes off the promise and fix them on the promise giver, because he is the promise keeper. Lesson 3, just coming to an end. We can engineer our own blessings versus waiting for God's. What are you waiting on God for right now? Think about it. However old you are in this room, what are you waiting on God for right now? How can you trust his timing and resist the temptation to help him out? This journey of faith is a journey of waiting. It is the wilderness journey as God gets the world out of us and teaches us to trust him. What are you waiting on God for right now? How can you trust his timing and resist the temptation to help him out? A growth in dependence is always linked to time. God uses the passage of time to teach us to trust in him. Everything within us wants to sort it out ourselves, particularly in the West. We want to engineer our own blessing, and God is saying, wait, trust me. And there are some people right now on the edge of trying to work things out yourself, and God's pulling you back off the edge and saying, trust me. You can trust me. I am reliable. If we let Yahweh into our lives in this area, the wall of mistrust that can so easily be built up in us, which I believe happened in Sarah because of her background, Yahweh, Jesus Christ, is faithfully able to chip away at that wall and teach us to trust him like he taught Sarah to trust him, to the point that she considered him who promised to be faithful. And then fourthly, our faith journey can inspire others. Our faith journey inspires others. I'm going to invite the band up. We're going to sing a song just a bit, but I want to say this. You know, our faith journey, our dependence on Jesus, our dependence on God is more powerful a witness than our preaching, than our worship, than this building, than the fact that we gather 500 or 600 people here on a Sunday. Our trust, what our neighbours see when we go through difficult times, how our neighbours see us in our waiting, see us in our trusting God, speaks volumes to the faithfulness of God. It's a huge shout. And you know, we read in Genesis 21, Sarah said that all who see me will laugh with me. There's something about the fulfillment of the promise, or even in our journey towards the promise, that talks to our friends and our neighbours and our family about the faithfulness of God too. So I want to encourage us as we remain faithful, as we look to him, like Sarah, we trust him with imperfect faith so much of the time. We step out of our comfort zones and we trust him. God said to Abraham and Sarah, your descendants will outnumber the stars in the heavens and the sand on the seashore. Just look around. There's lots of sand and there's lots of stars in this room. He who promised is faithful. This morning as I was just praying about this, I feel there's one, maybe two people in this room. And you've been worrying about how you're going to afford the school uniforms as you come into September. I just wanted you to say that he who promised is faithful. And maybe there's someone here and you're being bullied at school. Things are tough. You don't know what to do. Come to the one who's faithful. Pray about it. Lynn and I prayed for our grandson, our 8-year-old, a few months ago. He was being bullied at school. And 4 weeks ago, God came through and has sorted the whole situation out for us, for our grandson. It's the faithfulness of God. He's teaching me and he's teaching Lynn to trust him. He's faithful. Giving. Some of you are thinking, how can I give? I want to give into the life of the church, but how can I give? Trust him. Say to him, even this week, what can I give? How can I demonstrate faith? Faith is not being stupid, but faith is taking a risk and putting our confidence on God. It's so tempting to do it in our own strength, in our own way. But the promise maker is the promise keeper. Amen.